The air in the farmhouse cellar tasted of damp earth, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. It was April 1st, 1945, but no one was laughing. Outside, the spring rain was falling on the Ruhr Valley, washing the soot from the leaves, but inside the command post of Army Group B, the atmosphere was suffocating. Field Marshal Walter Model stood before the large situation map pinned to the peeling wall. His hands, usually steady as stone, rested on the edge of the table. To his staff officers standing in the shadows, he looked like a statue carved from granite, the unshakable fireman of the Reich. But Model wasn't looking at a map anymore. He was looking at a tombstone. The grease pencil lines told a story of absolute catastrophe. To the north, the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson was sweeping down like a hammer. To the south, the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges was driving up like an anvil. And at a small town called Lippstadt, just hours ago, the hammer had met the anvil. The report had come in via a crackling radio transmission that made every officer in the room freeze. American units had linked up. The circle was closed. Trapped inside this steel ring were 325,000 men, the entire Army Group B, the heart of the German military in the West. They were no longer an army fighting a war. They were rats caught in a trap that spanned 70 miles long and 50 miles wide. They called him the Fireman. It was a nickname whispered with a mix of reverence and pity across the Wehrmacht. It wasn't a title given for glory. It was a curse. It meant that Walter Model was never given a winning hand. He was never called when the sun was shining. He was only summoned when the front was collapsing, when the panic had set in, when the house was already half burned down. For 4 years, he had lived up to the name. On the frozen meat grinder of the Eastern Front, he had done the impossible. He had held Rzhev for 14 months against waves of Soviet infantry. He had stabilized the line after the disaster at Kursk. He was the man who turned routes into retreats, and retreats into defenses. But as he stared at the red arrows encircling his position, Model realized the fireman had finally arrived at a blaze he could not extinguish. This wasn't the vast expanse of Russia where he could trade land for time. This was Germany. This was the industrial heartland. And the enemy wasn't just numerous, they were relentless. He thought of the man who had made this disaster possible, General George S. Patton. For months, Model had warned Berlin. He had sent cables that were ignored, intelligence reports that were dismissed as pessimism. He had told them, Patton fights like us. He had told them that Patton wouldn't stop for supplies, that he would bypass strong points, that he would move faster than the doctrine allowed. Berlin had laughed. They called Patton a cowboy. Now, that cowboy's speed had shattered the Western Front so completely that Model's army was cut off before they even realized the danger. A young communications officer approached, holding a piece of paper with trembling fingers. Herr General Feldmarschall, he whispered, his voice cracking. A teletype from the Führer headquarters. Model didn't turn around. He knew what it said. He had served this regime too long to expect logic. Read it, he commanded, his voice low and gravelly. The Führer has declared the Ruhr pocket a fortress, the officer read, struggling with the words. Army Group B is to defend every inch of ground. The industrial capacity must be denied to the enemy. There will be no breakout. There will be no surrender. You are to fight to the last man. The silence that followed was louder than the distant artillery. To the last man, Model repeated softly. The words hung in the stale air. He looked at the faces of his staff men who had wives, children, futures. He looked at the map where the American pincers were tightening the noose. The order was clear. It was an order to commit mass suicide. It was an order to turn the Ruhr Valley into a graveyard for 1/3 sons. For the first time in his career, the fireman didn't reach for his bucket of water. He stared into the fire, and he felt something new rising in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard realization that the rulebook he had followed for 30 years was about to burn. Model left the suffocating air of the bunker and drove to the front. He needed to see the reality with his own eyes, away from the grease pencils and the madness of Berlin's teletypes. What he found was an army that existed only in name. He stood by a roadside near a camouflaged Panther tank. The machine was a beast of war, capable of destroying anything the Americans had. But it was silent. The engine was cold. The crew sat on the hull, smoking ersatz tobacco, their faces gray with grime and exhaustion. "Why aren't you moving into position?" Model asked the tank commander, a young Oberleutnant with the Iron Cross at his throat. The commander didn't jump to attention. He just looked at the field marshal with dead eyes. "No fuel, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. We have enough to idle the engine for 10 minutes. After that, it's just a pillbox." Model nodded. This was the reality. Berlin was moving divisions on a map, but on the ground, those divisions were statues. He looked south, towards the unseen lines where the Americans were advancing. He knew who was out there. It wasn't just the U.S. Army. It was him, the ghost of George S. Patton hung over the Ruhr like a shroud. Model's mind drifted back to December, the Battle of the Bulge. That was the moment he knew the war was truly lost. He had planned that offensive with mathematical precision. He had calculated that even if the Americans reacted, it would take Patton at least 2 weeks to turn his Third Army around and counterattack. 2 weeks. That was the standard military calculation. But Patton hadn't taken 2 weeks. He had done it in 3 days. Model remembered the intelligence reports from that week in December. They read like fiction. Patton had turned 3 full divisions 90 degrees on icy roads in the middle of a blizzard and marched them 100 miles to strike the German flank. It was impossible. It defied every rule of logistics and logic that the German general staff held sacred. But Patton had done it. He fought like a force of nature, not a general. He broke the rules, Model whispered to himself, standing by the silent tank. And because he broke them, we are broken. Now, that same relentless speed had closed the trap around the Ruhr. While Montgomery in the north was methodical and cautious, Patton in the south had raced across central Germany, bypassing resistance, ignoring his own supply lines, driving so fast that German units surrendered simply because they were breathless trying to keep up. Model returned to his staff car. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" "Back to the cage," Model said. Back at headquarters, the madness had escalated. General Karl Wagner, his chief of staff, met him at the door. "New orders, sir. Berlin expects a coordinated breakout to the east. We are to link up with the 12th Army under General Wenck." Model unbuttoned his heavy leather greatcoat and threw it onto a chair. He laughed, a dry, barking sound that had no humor in it. "The 12th Army," he sneered. "Wenck is fighting ghosts in the Harz Mountains. He cannot reach us. Berlin is moving phantom armies to save a corpse." He walked over to the window. The sky was darkening, lit only by the flashes of distant artillery. The encirclement was tightening. The mathematics were simple, and Walter Model was a man of numbers. 325,000 men, 0 fuel, minimal ammunition, and an enemy commander who moved faster than thought. "Wagner," Model said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If we follow these orders, every man in this pocket dies. Not for Germany, but for a delusion." He turned to face his chief of staff. The firelight flickered in his monocle. "I have spent my life holding lines. I have spent my life fixing disasters, but a fireman cannot put out a volcano." The decision was forming in his mind, cold and sharp. It was treason, it was dishonor. But as he thought of the young tank commander sitting on his useless Panther, Model realized that the definition of honor had changed. "Get the typewriters ready," Model ordered. "For a report to the Führer?" Wagner asked. "No," Model said, staring into the dark. "For something much more difficult. The battle for the Ruhr was raging outside, but inside the headquarters, the sound of war had changed. It was no longer the boom of artillery or the rattle of machine guns. It was the frantic, rhythmic clacking of typewriters. "Faster," Model ordered, pacing behind the row of clerks. "Every document is a life." He had done the unthinkable. He had ordered his staff to fabricate a massive lie. If he couldn't break the American ring of steel with tanks, he would slip through it with paper. The order he gave was simple yet terrifying. Dissolve the army group. But you cannot just tell 325,000 men to go home in the middle of a war zone. If they were caught by the Americans without papers, they would be prisoners of war. If they were caught by the SS roaming the rear areas, they would be shot as deserters. They needed a cover story. And so, the Fireman became a forger. Model instructed his officers to issue discharge papers for thousands of men. But these weren't ordinary discharges. They were backdated. They were falsified. Soldiers were suddenly reclassified as essential industrial workers, farmers needed for the harvest, or medically unfit civilians. "You are no longer Grenadier Muller," an officer told a confused teenager, handing him a stamped paper. "You are Muller the coal miner. Take off your tunic. Put on civilian clothes. Walk west. If the Americans stop you, show them this. If the SS stop you, pray." It was a bureaucratic masterstroke. Hitler had demanded a fortress, but Model was giving him a phantom. He was turning the Wehrmacht's most powerful fighting force into a cloud of smoke. But the risk was absolute. This was high treason. In Berlin, Goebbels was screaming on the radio about traitors and cowards. Flying courts-martial roving execution squads were hanging soldiers from lampposts for defeatism. Model knew that if Berlin found out what he was doing, they wouldn't just relieve him of command, they would hunt him down. General Wagner approached him with a stack of fresh reports. "The disbandment is working in the center sectors, sir. The men are melting away into the forests. But the SS units, they are refusing." Model's face darkened. The Waffen-SS units trapped in the pocket were fanatics. They still believed in the miracle weapons. They still believed Wank was coming, and they were threatening to open fire on Wehrmacht units that tried to disband. "They call us traitors," Wagner said quietly. Model adjusted his monocle, his eyes cold as ice. "Let them," he replied. "A traitor is a man who leads his soldiers into a meaningless death. I am saving Germany's sons for the Germany that comes after this madness." He walked to the map table. The pocket had split. The Americans had cut the artery. The end was accelerating. He saw the location of the SS units. "Keep our boys away from them," Model ordered. "Let the fanatics die for their ideology if they wish, but the rest, send them home." He looked down at his own hands. They were stained with ink from signing hundreds of papers. Ink, not blood. For a man who had spent 4 years wading through slaughter, the irony was not lost on him. He was ending his war not with a sword, but with a pen. But as the army evaporated around him, the question of his own fate began to loom larger. A soldier can become a civilian. A coal miner can go home. But a field marshal? A field marshal has nowhere to hide. The sky over the Ruhr was black, not with storm clouds, but with the oily smoke of 1,000 funeral pyres. But these weren't burning bodies. They were burning machines. Model stood in the shadow of a colossal blast furnace, watching the death of his army. In front of him, a crew of mechanics was working on a King Tiger tank. They weren't repairing it. They were killing it. A thermite grenade was dropped down the barrel. A dull thump echoed, and white-hot molten metal ate through the breech block, fusing the weapon into useless scrap. "It is done, Herr General Feldmarschall," the sergeant reported, wiping grease from his face. "She will never fire again." Model nodded slowly. "Better scrap metal than trophies for the Americans," he murmured. This was the reality of the fortress Ruhr. Across the shrinking pocket, the greatest war machine the world had ever seen was committing suicide. Artillery pieces were spiked. Trucks were drained of oil and run until their engines seized. Delicate optical equipment was smashed against brick walls. Model had ordered this. If he couldn't fight with these weapons, he would ensure Patton couldn't parade them down Fifth Avenue. But the destruction of equipment was easy. The destruction of the soldier was harder. As he drove through the shattered streets of Essen, Model saw the ghostly procession he had created. Men were walking west, not in marching columns, but in loose, ragged groups. They had stripped off their rank insignia. They had thrown away their helmets. They carried white handkerchiefs instead of rifles. They were walking out of the war, just as he had told them to. But the enemy was confused. Intelligence reports indicated that the American commanders, Ridgway, Gavin, Hodges, were baffled. They had expected a fanatical last stand, a Stalingrad on the Rhine. Instead, they were punching into a vacuum. They would capture a town and find thousands of German soldiers sitting on the curbs, waiting to be processed, holding the forged discharge papers Model's staff had typed the night before. The deception was holding, but the geography was failing. That afternoon, the final blow landed. A courier arrived on a motorcycle, his uniform covered in dust. "Sir!" he gasped. "The Americans have reached the Ruhr River at Witten. The pocket is cut in two." Model stared at the map. It was true. The steel noose had tightened so much that it had snapped the neck of the defense. Army Group B was now split into two smaller, isolated cauldrons. Model was in the eastern pocket, trapped in a shrinking forest region with his staff and a few thousand diehards. He was no longer commanding an army group. He was commanding a fugitive camp. "We move the headquarters to the forest," Model said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We leave the cities. We leave the civilians. We go into the woods." "Sir?" Colonel Pilling asked. "What about the radio link to Berlin?" Model looked at the heavy radio equipment, the lifeline to a Führer who demanded suicide. "Leave it," Model said. "We have nothing left to say to Berlin." As they packed the final crates, Model looked at his reflection in a broken mirror hanging on a ruined wall. The face staring back was gaunt. The monocle seemed ridiculous now, a piece of theater costume from a play that had already ended. He was the fireman who had let the house burn down to save the people inside. But as the convoy moved towards the dark sanctuary of the forest south of Duisburg, a new thought haunted him. The soldiers could become civilians. The officers could become prisoners. But a field marshal? He touched the pistol holster at his belt. The metal was cold. He knew that while he had forged a path to life for 325,000 men, he had walled himself into a corner where only one exit remained. The world of Field Marshal Walter Model had shrunk from a continent to a country, then to a valley, and now to a single room in a forester's lodge, hidden deep in the woods. Outside, the spring leaves were vibrant green, indifferent to the dying Reich. Inside, the air was thick with the smoke of burning documents. Colonel Theodore Pilling, his intelligence officer, entered the room. He didn't salute. The time for salutes had passed. He placed a document on the heavy oak table. It wasn't a tactical report. It was a letter. "From General Ridgway, sir," Pilling said quietly, "the American commander of the 18 Airborne Corps. He sent it under a flag of truce." Model picked up the paper. It was written in English, translated into German below. He read the words of his enemy. Matthew Ridgway was a soldier's soldier, a man Model respected. The letter was honorable. It urged Model to surrender, to avoid further useless bloodshed. It promised fair treatment for him and his staff, consistent with the Geneva Convention. It was an offer of life. For a fleeting moment, the temptation was there, to walk out of these woods, to sleep in a bed, to stop running. Model looked at Pilling, seeing the desperate hope in the colonel's eyes. Pilling wanted him to say yes. Pilling wanted to live. "They promise dignity," Pilling ventured. "They know you are a professional, sir. You are not Himmler. You are not Goebbels. You are a soldier." Model dropped the letter onto the table as if it were contaminated. He walked to the window, staring at the sliver of sky visible through the trees. "You are naive, Pilling," he said, his voice raspy. "You see the Americans as they see themselves, knights in shining armor. I see them as they are allies of the Bolsheviks." He turned, his face contorted with a sudden, sharp anger. This was the truth he had carried like a cancer. "Do you think the war ends when I hand over my pistol? No. The Americans will take my picture. They will interrogate me. And then?" He stepped closer to Pilling. "Then they will look at their lists. The lists from Moscow." Model knew his name was written in blood in the Kremlin. He had commanded on the Eastern Front for years. He had ordered the scorched earth policies during the retreat from Leningrad. He had burned villages to deny shelter to the Red Army. He had done what was necessary to save his lines, but in the eyes of the Soviets, he was a monster. "I am a wanted man, Colonel," Model whispered. "If I surrender to Ridgway today, I will be in a cell in the Lubyanka prison next week. The Americans will hand me over to Stalin as a diplomatic gift, and I will not. I will never let the Bolsheviks put me in a cage." He remembered Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad. The humiliation. The Soviet cameras filming a German field marshal sitting on a cot, broken, reading propaganda scripts. The thought made Model's skin crawl. He would not be another Paulus. He would not be a trophy for Stalin to parade through Red Square. "But sir," Pilling argued, "we can negotiate terms. We can demand asylum in the West." "There is no West anymore," Model shouted, slamming his hand on the mantelpiece. "There is only the ruin we have made. A field marshal does not bargain for his life like a horse trader." He took a deep breath, regaining his composure. The mask of the fireman slid back into place. He picked up Ridgway's letter and held it over the flame of a candle. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "We are dissolving the staff," Model said, his voice cold and final. "Tell the officers they are free to go. Tell them to surrender to the Americans individually. They will be treated well. They are small fish. And you, sir? Pilling asked, his voice trembling. Model brushed the ash from his hands. I am the whale, Pilling, and the whale does not swim into the net. He checked the magazine of his Walther P-38. It was full. He didn't need a full magazine. He only needed one round. The decision was no longer about strategy or tactics. It was about choosing the executioner. And Walter Model had decided that the only man fit to execute a German field marshal was himself. The forests of the Ruhr had witnessed battles since the days of the Roman legions, but they had never seen anything like this. It was a reverse mobilization. Under the canopy of ancient oaks, the most disciplined army in the world was stripping itself naked. Field Marshal Model walked through the bivouac areas. It was quiet, eerie, unnatural quiet. There were no sergeants screaming orders. There were no engines revving. Instead, there was the soft rustle of cloth and the clinking of metal hitting the ground. He watched a group of hardened veterans from the 116th Panzer Division. These men, who had stormed across Europe, were now methodically destroying their identity. They tore the eagle insignias from their tunics. They buried their iron crosses in the mud. They threw their Kar 98 rifles into a pile that was growing into a mountain of steel. A sergeant major, a man with a scarred face, looked up and saw Model. Instinctively, his hand twitched to salute, but he stopped. There was no rank here anymore. Go home to your families, Model said, his voice soft but carrying through the trees. The Reich is dead. Do not let yourselves die with it. The sergeant major nodded slowly, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Thank you, Herr General Feldmarschall, he whispered. Then he turned, picked up a rucksack filled with scavenged food, and walked west not as a soldier but as a man. Model's order was working. The American advance was slowing down, not because of resistance, but because of confusion. U.S. patrols reported capturing thousands of civilians who walked with a military gait, men who carried discharge papers that looked official but smelled of fresh ink. The Americans were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of humanity surrendering to the landscape itself. But not everyone accepted the gift of life. Deep in the woods, the roar of a motorcycle broke the silence. A squad of Waffen-SS Feldgendarmerie military police screeched to a halt near Model's command car. Their leader, a Sturmbannführer with fanaticism burning in his eyes, jumped off. His submachine gun was leveled at a group of Wehrmacht soldiers, changing their clothes. Traitors, the SS officer screamed. Cowards! The Führer has ordered victory or death. Anyone found out of uniform will be shot. He raised his weapon. The Wehrmacht soldiers froze. They were unarmed. Lower your weapon, a voice commanded. It was low, gravelly, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Model stepped out from the shadows of the trees. He was still wearing his greatcoat, his monocle in place, his field marshal's baton in his hand. He looked like a god of war amidst the ruins. The SS officer hesitated. Even in the chaos of collapse, the sight of a field marshal was paralyzing. Herr General Feldmarschall, the SS man stammered, These men are deserting. My orders are clear. Your orders come from a bunker in Berlin that has lost touch with reality, Model said, stepping closer until the barrel of the gun was inches from his chest. My orders come from the reality of this forest. I have dissolved Army Group B. These men are civilians under my protection. He leaned in, his face inches from the fanatic. If you fire that weapon, you will not be shooting deserters. You will be shooting your brothers, and I will personally ensure you do not leave these woods alive. The SS officer trembled. The entire Nazi structure was built on obedience, but here the hierarchy was shattering. He looked at Model, then at the unarmed men, and finally lowered his gun. He spat on the ground, signaled his squad, and sped off deeper into the pocket, looking for someone easier to kill. Model watched them go. He had won the skirmish, but the war was closing in. He turned to his aide. We must move. The Americans are closing the net at Ratingen. The space is getting smaller. Where do we go, sir? The aide asked. Model looked at the dense forest to the south. Deeper into the woods, he said. The stage is almost empty, but the final act must be played in private. He walked past the pile of discarded rifles. He didn't look back. The fireman had saved the building's occupants, but now the roof was coming down on him. It was Adolf Hitler's 650th birthday. In Berlin, in the Führer bunker, they were likely drinking champagne and pretending the end wasn't days away. But here, in the mud of the Ruhr, there was no celebration. There was only the cold, relentless rain and the sound of American jeeps prowling the perimeter of the woods. Field Marshal Walter Model sat on a fallen log, his uniform soaked through. The leather greatcoat that had shielded him from the Russian winter was now heavy and suffocating. The army group was gone. The staff was gone. All that remained were 3 men: Colonel Pilling, his adjutant, and a driver who refused to leave. They were no longer soldiers. They were fugitives. "Sir," Pilling whispered, crouching low as the sound of an engine grew louder on the nearby road. "We need to cross the railway line tonight. If we can reach the Rhine, maybe we can swim across. Blend in with the refugees." Model looked at his loyal intelligence officer. Pilling was exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, shivering in the damp air. He was still trying to plan, still trying to find a tactical solution to a hopeless strategic problem. "Swim the Rhine?" Model asked, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "And then what, Pilling? Do we walk to Berlin? Do we walk to the Alps? There is nowhere left to go." He pulled a map from his pocket, not a military map, but a simple civilian road map he had taken from a gas station days ago. He tapped a spot near Duisburg. "We are here. The Americans are here, here, and here." He folded the map. "We are in a box, and the lid is nailed shut." Suddenly, the crack of a twig snapping made them all freeze. Hands went to holsters. Through the mist, they saw a shadow moving. It wasn't an American. It was a German soldier, a boy of maybe 16, dragging a wounded leg. He wore a uniform that was too big for him, clutching a rifle with no bolt. The boy saw the officers and stopped, terror in his eyes. He didn't see a field marshal. He saw authority. He saw a court-martial. "Come here, son," Model said softly. The boy limped forward. "I lost my unit, sir. I didn't run away. They just left." Model stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bar of chocolate, part of his emergency rations. He handed it to the boy. "You didn't lose them. They are gone. The war is over for you." He pointed west, towards the American lines. "Go that way. Keep your hands up. Do not run. The Americans will feed you." The boy stared at the chocolate, then at the man with the monocle. He nodded, mumbled a thank you, and limped away into the fog. Model watched him go. That boy was the reality of the Third Reich's final stand, broken children fighting for a broken dream. "Sir," Pilling said, his voice urgent, "we cannot stay here. An American patrol will sweep this sector by morning." Model turned to his officers. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. As long as he was with them, they were in mortal danger. If the Americans found 3 officers, they might just capture them. But if they found Field Marshal Walter Model, the Lion of Defense, the man wanted by the Kremlin, the encounter could turn into a firefight. He was a lightning rod for death. "You are right, Colonel," Model said. "We cannot stay here together." He stood up and brushed the pine needles from his coat. The decision he had been wrestling with for days had finally settled. He needed to be alone, not just for his sake, but for theirs. "I am a burden to you," Model stated flatly. "I am a target. You have a chance to survive if you are just anonymous officers. With me, you are accomplices." "We will not leave you, sir," the driver protested. "That is not a request," Model snapped, the old iron returning to his voice for a second. Then he softened. "It is my final order. You will separate. You will save yourselves. I have one last piece of business to attend to." He looked at the darkening sky. The rain was turning to a mist. The stage was set. The audience was gone. The fireman was alone in the ashes. "Tomorrow," Model said, looking at the trees that would be his final command post. "Tomorrow, we end it." The sun rose over the Ruhr, but it brought no warmth. The light was pale and watery, filtering through the ancient oak trees like jagged shards of glass. For Field Marshal Walter Model, this was the last sunrise he would ever see. He stood by the trunk of a massive tree, shaving with a dry razor and a small pocket mirror hung on a low branch. Even here, at the end of the world, discipline remained. He buttoned his tunic, straightened his collar, and adjusted the knight's cross around his neck. He would not meet God looking like a fugitive. Colonel Pilling and the driver stood a few meters away, watching him in silence. They had hardly slept. The forest was alive with the sounds of the encroaching enemy, the grinding of tank treads, the distant shout of American voices. The net was now so tight it was strangling them. Model turned to face them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope and a simple gold wedding band. He held them out to Colonel Pilling. "Theodore," Model said, using the officer's first name for the first time, "if you make it through, if you survive the camps, find my wife. Find Hella. Give her these." Pilling took the items, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The ring felt heavy, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. "I will, sir. I swear it on my life." Model nodded, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. Tell her I died as a soldier. Tell her I did not betray my country, and I did not betray my men. Tell her I chose the only path left to a man of honor." He then turned to the driver, a young sergeant who had driven him from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Germany. "And you, son, you have been faithful, but your duty to me ends here." Model unpinned a medal from his own chest, a silver wound badge, and pressed it into the boy's hand. "Go now. Head towards the river. Do not look back." The driver began to weep, silent, racking sobs that shook his thin frame. He grabbed Model's hand and kissed it, a gesture from a bygone era of kings and knights. Model gently pulled his hand away and gripped the boy's shoulder. "Be a civilian now," Model commanded softly. "Build a life. That is your new order." The two men lingered, unable to tear themselves away. Leaving their commander felt like a crime, a violation of everything they had been taught. But Model's gaze was steel. He pointed towards the west, towards the gap in the trees where escape was still a faint possibility. "Go," he barked, the voice of the field marshal returning one last time. Pilling snapped a sharp salute, tears streaming down his face. "Goodbye, Herr General Feldmarschall." They turned and ran. They ran through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots, driven by a mix of fear and grief. They ran until the figure of the small man in the leather coat was lost in the morning mist. Model watched them go until the forest swallowed them. Now, silence returned. He was truly alone. No staff, no army, no orders. Just the man, the forest, and the ghosts of 300,000 soldiers. He reached down and picked up a handful of damp earth. It was German soil. He crumbled it between his fingers. He had fought for every inch of this dirt. He had burned half of Russia to protect it. And now, it would be his grave. He checked his watch. 7 a.m. It was time. He turned and walked deeper into the thicket, seeking the darkest part of the woods, where the shadows were long and the world could not see what was about to happen. The forest was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic grinding of Sherman tanks. To Walter Model, that sound was familiar. It was the sound of the future arriving to bury the past. He was alone now, truly alone. For 30 years, he had been surrounded by aides, maps, telephones, and soldiers. He had been the center of a whirlwind, the man whose voice moved armies. Now, the only audience he had was the squirrels darting through the underbrush and the gray sky peering through the leaves. Model leaned against the rough bark of a massive oak tree. The dampness of the moss seeped through his coat, but he didn't feel it. He felt light. The crushing weight of responsibility. The lives of 325,000 men. The defense of the Reich. The impossible orders from Berlin had all evaporated. He had disbanded the army. He had sent the boys home. The fireman had put out his last fire. He reached into his holster and withdrew his Walther P-38 service pistol. The metal was cold and heavy. He ejected the magazine, checked the rounds, and slid it back in with a sharp metallic click. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times on the practice range, but today it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. He held the weapon in his gloved hand, staring at the manufacturing stamp. Walther. A good German machine. Reliable, efficient, just like him. His mind drifted back to the Eastern Front. He saw the snow. He saw the burning villages. He saw the faces of the men he had ordered to hold to the last bullet. He had been ruthless. He knew that. He had done terrible things in the name of necessity. But he had told himself it was for Germany. Not for the party, not for the man with the mustache, but for Germany. Was it? He whispered to the trees. Or was I just another cog in the machine? The question hung in the air, unanswered. It didn't matter now. The verdict had been written long ago. He thought of the Soviets. He could almost feel their breath on his neck. If he waited here, if he let the Americans find him, the diplomatic wheels would turn. He would be crated up and shipped east. He imagined the show trial in Moscow. The bright lights, the jeering crowds, the script they would force him to read, denouncing his own men. "No," Model said, his voice firm. "I will not be a puppet." He looked at the pistol again. This wasn't suicide, he told himself. Suicide was an act of despair. This was a tactical redeployment. This was moving from a battlefield where he could no longer fight to a place where the enemy could never touch him. It was the ultimate act of defiance. A field marshal does not surrender his sword, he breaks it. He unbuttoned the top of his leather greatcoat to access his tunic. He felt the iron cross at his throat. He wanted to die wearing it. It was the symbol of the soldier, not the politician. Through the trees, he heard a twig snap. Louder this time. Voices. American voices. "Check that ridge! I saw movement!" They were close. Maybe 200 meters. The hunters were closing in on the lion. Model straightened his back. He brushed a speck of mud from his sleeve. Even in the face of death, he was a Prussian officer. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. It was a good smell. It smelled of home. He raised the pistol. His hand did not shake. The fireman was steady to the end. "I have served," Model whispered. "And now I am dismissed." He closed his eyes, shutting out the ruined world, and waited for the darkness to take him. A single shot rang out. It was sharp, cracking the damp morning air like a whip. It echoed briefly off the trunks of the ancient oaks, startling a flock of crows into the gray sky. And then, almost instantly, the forest returned to silence. Field Marshal Walter Model, the fireman of the Reich, the man who had stopped the Red Army at Rzhev and terrified the Allies at Arnhem, slumped against the tree. The war was over for him. He had not waited for the Americans. He had not waited for the Russians. He had seized the final authority over his own existence. Later that day, his adjutant, Colonel Pilling, who had heard the shot from a distance, returned with the driver. They did not have a coffin. They did not have a flag to drape over him. They dug a shallow grave in the soft earth at the base of the oak tree. There were no gun salutes, no speeches about glory, no final orders from the Führer. They buried Germany's greatest defensive tactician like a common soldier, marking the spot only with a simple wooden cross that bore no name. 17 days later, on the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The 1,000-year Reich had burned to ash in 12 years. But in the ruins of the Ruhr, a different story was emerging. As American forces secured the pocket, they were baffled. They didn't find a starving fanatical army fighting to the death as Hitler had ordered. Instead, they found over 300,000 men who had simply stopped. They found men with discharge papers, signed by a ghost. Walter Model had committed many crimes in the East. His hands were not clean. They were stained with the brutality of a war of annihilation. But in his final act, he had saved 325,000 of his own countrymen from a pointless death. He had chosen to be a traitor to his government, so he could be a savior to his men. History remembers the victors. It remembers Patton, the man whose lightning speed had forced Model into that forest. It remembers Eisenhower and Montgomery. But the story of the Ruhr pocket serves as a dark, complex reminder of the human cost of blind loyalty and the moment when that loyalty finally breaks. In 1955, Model's son, Hans-Georg, guided by the former driver, returned to the forest. They exhumed the body and moved it to a military cemetery in Wassenach. Today, Walter Model lies there, surrounded by the soldiers he commanded. He remains a paradox, a brilliant general who served an evil regime, a ruthless enforcer who showed mercy only at the very end, a man who feared the judgment of the Soviets more than the judgment of God. In the end, the fireman couldn't save the house. It burned to the ground, but when the roof was collapsing, he pushed his children out the door, locked it from the inside, and let the flames take him.